So, welcome, Madeleine Bunting. Thank you very, very much for agreeing to talk to us this afternoon in Enrichment. We're going to be really interested to hear about your career as a writer in many different forms, because you've been a journalist for The Guardian, you are a novelist, and you've also written a number of non-fiction books. So you know about writing from many different angles, which I think is what will interest a lot of us here. As I've said to you, a lot of people here are interested in things like fashion journalism. A number of students write scripts and are interested in becoming filmmakers. So writing is an activity that it's obviously at the heart of every student's life anyway, because everybody's writing essays. So later on, we'll talk about what constitutes good writing, that big $64 million question on which everyone probably has a different opinion. But could we start, Madeleine, by talking about how you began your career? How did you get started?
Sure, absolutely. So it's lovely to talk to you all, and anyone who feels like they can switch their cameras on, that's great. It's always lovely to see faces, but I understand if you want to keep quiet. And I do hope you might pop comments in the chat, because then that's really helpful. I can then, direct my comments to whatever your particular interest is. So shall I tell you how one of the first things I started with, because actually it was in a very ill-fated attempt to get into fashion journalism. So I was at Cambridge at the time, and I was doing a lot of student journalism. I'd already decided that I wanted to be a journalist, and there was some very distant connection of my mother's who said, well, tell her to come and see me. And I'm sure you guys all dressed very, very carefully and are beautifully dressed, but I at Cambridge didn't have very much money, and I think I sort of scraped together a few borrowed clothes from various friends and traipsed down to London looking a complete wreck. I mean, I looked absolutely ghastly, I remember very sort of shabby clothing. And I turned up at Harper's and Queen to meet this editor. And she just looked me up and down and she said, are you interested in fashion? And she had me in one, because I was like, sort of. The truth was, of course, I wasn't interested in fashion. I was very interested in book reviewing or features or any other aspect of a fashion magazine. So sadly, that possibility didn't really come off, and I didn't get a job. But I think what that illustrates is that I was prepared to really take any opportunity to break into the industry. I just was prepared to do anything in terms of writing to get experience. And I had decided at about 19, when I was on my gap year, that I wanted to write. And I really had actually decided I wanted to, I was a volunteer in Sri Lanka, and I was there when a civil war broke out. And I thought, I want to understand what's happening here. And I can't ask questions. People won't give me answers. So I think really my starting point with journalism was curiosity. I wanted to be able to ask people questions, and for them not to turn around and say to me, why are you asking? And that is the extraordinary thing about journalism, is you get a license to ask questions. And it lasted me, 25-year career at The Guardian. Every time I wanted to find out something, I picked up the phone or I went to see somebody and I started asking questions. And the amazing thing is that most of the time people want to give you answers. There's something very human in that interaction. They want to explain their circumstances. So the image we sometimes have of journalists kind of putting the foot in the door to try and talk to somebody, it doesn't happen that often. Even when there's been a terrible tragedy, and I was there, in the immediate aftermath of bombings by the IRA. In London, bombings. Another bombing I was at was in Kent, on the coastal town of Deal. I turned up, a very young reporter, and I was talking to relatives. I was talking to local people who were very, very shocked. They wanted their story told, and that's the really remarkable thing about journalism, is that you're helping people tell their stories all the time. And if you bring some sort of ethical perspective to that, which at The Guardian was very, very important, we tried to find stories we believed were important, and we tried to be respectful about the way we told those stories. And that was a very kind of important guiding principle. And it meant that I found stories that were really heartbreaking, which were really important, that you know, needed to be heard. And that was the sort of starting point, the kind of curiosity. And it's always been a tough industry to get into. There's always more people wanting to get into journalism than there are jobs. That's always been the case, and I fear it's even more the case now. But it meant that as a sort of 19, 20-year-old, I was really quite methodical about thinking, okay, I want to get experience. So I worked on a local newspaper in Worthing because I was living in Brighton at the time. No pay. All of this was work experience. I worked for House and Garden. I knew nothing about interiors and furniture. But the idea, hang on, I'm just going to turn that little beeping sound. You can probably hear it. I'm just going to turn it off. It's my mail. It just needs quitting. So I ended up writing features about a doll's house. And there was I, aged 20, with this absolutely brilliant photographer, and you know, a whole team of us went to photograph what is probably the most lavish doll's house that has ever been built. And it became a feature in House and Garden magazine. That's where I started. That wasn't what I was interested in, doll's houses, but it was that versatility to basically pick up any story, any kind of story, whether it was a traffic jam in Worthing or a doll's house for House and Garden, or even try my luck with a fashion magazine. And then there's all sorts of other things which I can't quite recall now, but all alongside that, I was doing every type of journalism at university that I could find, which meant I became the editor of the arts page on the student newspaper, which I really, really enjoyed. I edited a magazine on third world development, which I also really enjoyed. I remember at one point someone interviewed me and said, you know, hang on, dolls houses, third world development, we don't call it third world anymore, developing world, you know, poverty in Africa, you know, hang on, you just seem to be so interested in so many things. And I was, and I still am. And actually, I don't think that's a problem in journalism. To be interested in lots and lots of things is a great asset, because you have to be very sort of versatile and adaptable. So one of the things is that, Massimo, did you want to say something, Massimo? Maybe we put people, he's on mute now. Yeah, so one of the things that you have to be prepared for as a reporter was I could be sent absolutely anywhere. So on any day without any notice. So I would turn up for work at, you know, we started late at The Guardian, 10:30, and I would have no idea what was going to happen in my day. Absolutely none whatsoever. And several times I would turn up at 10:30 and they would say, could you go straight back out of the office, down to the tube, catch a train, you know, we'll explain where you're going and what you're doing, you know, when you get there, type of thing. So I ended up covering riots in Oxford for several days, having been sent from the office with no change of clothes, nothing. I didn't have a toothbrush. I remember running from the kind of the street where the riots were going on to buy a toothbrush, and of course to find somewhere to stay the night. But you know, I had no suitcase. I checked into the hotel. They're like, "Where's your luggage?" And I didn't have any. And that is exactly the kind of versatility and adaptability that is essential as a reporter. On another occasion, I was due to work on a Sunday. There was I thinking it'd be a nice, you know, rather sleepy Sunday shift. I got a phone call at 8 o'clock in the morning. Can you drive down to Exeter? There's been a riot in a prison on Dartmoor. You know, of course, you have to find somewhere to stay in Dartmoor. I have to find out what the story is about. So that curiosity, adaptability, you know, one day I could be writing about traffic jams on the M25. The next day I could be writing about the IRA and a bombing, or, you know, some other kind of really big national story. So it's a funny old job because it's full of unpredictability and uncertainty. It was only once I got beyond being what's called a general reporter that life became a bit more predictable. So I then moved into religious affairs reporting, which I chose to do. I've always been fascinated by religion. And it was at a time when Islam was beginning to become a major question in British politics about what exactly is Islam and who are the Muslims we turn to explain what Islam is about to us. And I loved all that, threw myself right into the middle of it, fascinated by the Jewish community, and covered all sorts of stories that were related to religion and the Christian churches. So Catholicism, there was just the beginnings of the stories around the abuse by priests, which became such a big thing. And I followed that story through, if you like. And at that point, I was writing for every part of the paper. So I would write news stories, I'd write features, and that's again about that adaptability. A news report, you have to write it really fast and succinct. You don't really have very long. It's not going to be much longer than 700 or 800 words. And you're always aware of word counts. You're always getting told, okay, 700 words, Madeleine, by 5 o'clock. And then a sub-editor takes it off you and they tidy it up a bit, make sure you haven't made spelling mistakes, clear up the typos, change sentences around that they think you haven't got quite right. And it's very formulaic. It's kind of ordering the information in a particular way to grab the reader's attention. Features, you have much more kind of room to actually develop your own style and to write in a way that you like, explaining the story and I really liked that sort of different mix. I loved writing features. Everybody preferred features to news reports because you've got a bit more chance to sort of write a bit more, put a bit more of your own style into the writing. And I did that for 3 years, and it was terrific. I was so busy and wrote loads and loads of stuff. And then I became what's called a leader writer. And I did that for 3 years. And the leader writer is a totally different skill. Now, you probably haven't even noticed leaders or editorials, as they're sometimes called, but it's when the newspaper itself is making a statement about what it thinks about the news story of the day. So they're not signed because they're always effectively the newspaper's view. So they may say, Boris Johnson has made a terrible mess of the handling of the pandemic. I mean, The Guardian has been writing those editorials for about 6 months. And they're very short. So they're like maybe 600 words would be the first leader. The second leader about 400 words. And the third leader was about 200 or 300 words. And my God, what a skill of precision and concise writing that was. You're basically writing on the back of a postcard. And you're trying to often deal with enormous issues, such as, I remember writing leaders about the Northern Irish peace process, which is back in the news now over the Brexit deal, but that was 1997 on the Good Friday Agreement. This is really complicated stuff, and you're basically, you discuss what leaders need to be written at 12 o'clock in the morning with the editor. That was Alan Rusbridger at the time. And you need to be filing is how we describe it, when you send your story off, and you need to really file by 5:30, and you'll have the sub-editors going, Madeleine, where's your copy? And it's a very pressured environment because you're in a newsroom with lots of other people who are all working under a lot of time pressure as well. And then from leaders, I became a columnist, and I did that for 12 years. And that is, it's a great job. It's a really, really great job because you get to decide what to write about in a discussion with your the page editor. You get a lot of chance to put your own style into what you're saying, to articulate and define your own ideas and opinions about things. And it's a huge privilege because, not that many people become columnists, and the newspaper or news organization, what they try to do is to get a broad range of opinion, and they try to have a kind of mix of voices, and it's very, very competitive to get to that point of being a columnist. And that's what I did until I left. So I'd had a very varied career with lots of different ways of writing over the course of that career.
So Madeleine, could I just ask, how do you think journalism has, changed quite a lot in the last sort of 10 to 15 years? Has it shrunk in a sense that there are far fewer jobs now? Print journalism, I mean, a lot of newspapers have closed, sadly. magazines as well. Perhaps, do you think the number of jobs overall has shrunk and that it's now much harder to become a journalist? And if so, what would you advise? How do people break into it now?
So I think what's happened over the last sort of 20 years has been a constant process of change around journalism. And the way in which the web has changed journalism is enormous. In some ways, it's been a good thing because it makes freelancing much, much more possible to get. You know, you can start writing a brilliant blog, and if you're very clever about, you know, how you use search engines, how you promote your work, you can get noticed, and you can short circuit really all the kind of apprenticeship type training which was kind of traditional. There are fewer secure paid jobs in the sense of the kind of job I had, which was a very secure job. You're absolutely right. Those kinds of jobs are like gold dust and they've shrunk. But I think the kind of paradox, if you like, is that the jobs have shrunk, but the amount being published has never been greater. You know, when I think about the fight to get space in the paper, that was the big competition back when I started as a journalist. And that was because there was very limited space in the paper. And now, of course, on the web, there is no limit to space. And it means that one of the interesting initiatives that I was, a colleague of mine was very closely, that ran and I was closely involved with, was the opening up of Comment is Free, which was this, you know, the kind of website of The Guardian where they just decided, okay, let's get loads of different voices contributing pieces. And that was an incredible expanding of the number of people that were being, you know, that were sort of discussing and arguing. And the fact that you can self-publish, you can write your own blog, makes the bar of entry much, much lower. There's lots and lots of ways now to get your voice out there, to get your story and your writing out there.
Is it true to say that newspaper editors and magazine editors are keeping an eye on the sort of blogosphere, as it were, and looking out for new talent in that way, or looking at Instagram or any of the other platforms? Does that happen?
So I think it does to some extent. So I think if you are beginning to make waves and you're beginning to attract attention, then they will spot you and they will, you know, and if your kind of writing is really interesting. So I can think of a couple of people who are now on The Guardian who started in that way. It would be wrong to say that the editors have got nothing else to do but sit around and kind of wander through the blogosphere, because that's clearly not the case. You know, it's always a very pressured environment, journalism. But, you know, if you are clever and you know how to write and you've worked out how to make your blog distinctive and you're doing a good job of it and you're building up a big following, then you will get noticed. And it's not just editors looking, publishers will be looking as well. Publishers are very, very good at looking out for talent and then approaching the person and saying, listen, I like your blog. Can't we make this into a book? I mean, I've come across lots and lots of authors who sort of broke into it that way. I mean, you know, we're talking exclusively about journalism, but I think with writing, I think publishers have got more time to actually go hunting for talent. So that was not possible when I was starting out, but you can really set out your stall now. And if you're good and you really pay attention and work hard at it, you know, it's absolutely incredible what you can achieve. So harder and easier, you know, it's a weird combination, but it is a very, very different sort of media landscape. Will you get a permanent full-time job? Unlikely. Could you build up a very, very interesting, satisfying, rewarding career? Quite possibly. And can you hit the big time? Possible. You know, some people go from blogging to stardom, you know, so it's, you know, there's no kind of general rule here. Working out what you want to write, how you want to write it is key. You know, there was J.K. Rowling sitting in a cafe in Edinburgh as a single mother, desperate to try and, you know, rub two pennies together. Who would have thought she'd end up as one of the richest women in the world? There are these extraordinary sort of rags to riches sort of stories and of course, there's many other stories about single mothers who are sadly, or single fathers, or wherever, who don't make it. So it requires lots of determination, lots of skill, and a bit of luck.
I think the wasn't the Booker Prize winner that was announced the other day turned down by 30 publishers.
Shirley Byrne, yeah, absolutely. You should never take a publisher's rejection slip as a reason to stop. J.K. Rowling was turned down from dozens of publishers as well. It's it's not a nice experience, I imagine, being rejected, but it doesn't necessarily mean the book's no good.
Absolutely. So Madeleine, tell us a bit about your novel, and which was, tell us when it was published, and I have a copy of it here, which perhaps everybody can see, Island Story. I think the inspiration for it was some work and research that you did on a history book that preceded it about the Channel Islands during the war. But could you tell us a bit about how that all came about, and how your process for writing it as well?
Yes. So one of the things that I did alongside my journalism, and they sort of fed each other, is I wrote books. So my first book I wrote was published in 1995, and that came out of a journalism story. So this is where I was very interested in the German occupation of the Channel Islands in the Second World War. I wrote a couple of stories in the newspaper, and a publisher got in contact with me and said, why don't you turn this into a book? So I ended up writing a history of the period, which was fascinating. I don't know if any of you have ever seen any films. Lily James did a film recently about the occupation of Jersey in the Channel Islands. But it's how do you maintain resistance? How do you end up collaborating with the Germans? Occupation was a deeply traumatic experience for large parts of Europe in the Second World War, and the Channel Islands is Britain's one small example of that. And it was a very, very vivid. There were still lots of islanders in the 1990s who had lived through it. So I interviewed them. I found archival material in Moscow and London and Paris that had never been looked at before. And I managed to track down the Russian slave laborers that had been taken from Russia by the Germans to work in the Channel Islands. So I went to Russia in 1991 and to Russia and Ukraine, and found these slave laborers who had worked on the Channel Islands in the Second World War for the Germans under terrible violence and oppression, and many of their compatriots had been killed and murdered by the terrible working conditions. So it was an extraordinary history book to write, and immediately as I was writing it, I knew I wanted to write a novel, because I felt there were some stories that I couldn't quite get to. There was still such discretion and privacy, and people didn't want to talk about it. And of course, that was the issue about some Channel Island women fell in love with German soldiers. Stands to reason, if the Germans were there for 5 years, these things happen. But I only managed to find one couple who would talk to me about it. And they'd gone on to get married, actually. They lived in Devon, and he was German and she was British, and she was a Channel Islander. And they, 70 years on, they were still deeply in love, but they had a terrible time in the Second World War. So it was trying to sort of think, well, can I imagine what might have happened? Where the gaps are in the historical record. Can I sort of piece together a story? And that was the beginning of the Island Song, the novel. And now it took me 20 years to write that novel. So I wrote the first draft in 1999 after I'd finished the history book. And my publishers then were HarperCollins, and they said, well, it's good, but it's not quite there. It's not quite right. So I'm really sorry, we can't take it. And I was very disappointed, and I sort of lost faith. And that's the really big thing when it comes to novel writing, is you have to believe in yourself, because nobody else is going to. You've just got to keep going. And I do actually think that's the hardest thing of all. That's harder than being a brilliant writer. Lots of brilliant writers, believe you me, there are lots of really brilliant writers, but they never manage to finish their novel. And the reason why they don't is because of lack of self-belief. So you have to have quite a sort of determined sort of risk-taking character, I think, because ultimately it is a risk. You're putting your head above the parapet. You're going to write a novel, and some people may think it's rubbish, and that's the risk. And you just have to do it anyway. And I think also there's a risk that you could spend a lot of time for nothing, because it's not an easy job writing a novel. I find it really hard. Not the first draft, that's easy. You know, I write furiously fast because I've got that journalist training of writing very, very fast. But then the process of editing again and again and again and again is grueling. There's no other word for it. And I promise you, you can tell the minute you open a book whether somebody's done that work or not. And if they haven't done the work, the novel doesn't stand up. So every single word in a novel has been weighed. Is it the right word? Is it the right place? Am I And then you're thinking about the plot. Am I telling the reader enough at this point for them to understand what's going on, but not telling them to keep them reading? Because it's all about how you tell the story and which bits of the plot you reveal when and how, and where this is all going in terms of sort of the architecture of the novel. So you're doing several different things all at the same time with a novel. You want the sentence to sound right. You want the plot to make sense and to keep the reader engaged. And at the same time, you're really trying to create atmosphere, to create really vivid characters that sort of jump off the page at you. So I do feel sometimes that, I use a lot of metaphor when I'm writing, but I do feel it's a bit like conducting an orchestra when you're writing a novel. So you're kind of going, yeah, okay, we'll have, drums and bass now, please, and violins now, please. And you have to get that sort of all working together at the same time. And that's very, very hard to pull off in the first draft. I don't believe anyone does it in the first draft. I talked to one novelist last summer. We did an event together at a book festival. He said he does 13 drafts, full drafts. And he said when he gets to about the 8th draft, he reads it aloud to himself, the whole thing from start to finish. I thought that was really interesting advice, to be able to hear your own novel. And then when he's got to the 13th draft, he flies over to America to his editor, who has a house in Long Island or something, and they sit down in her country house and he reads the whole thing to her, which I thought was an amazing thing as part of an editorial process. But there's no shortcut. I don't believe. Some novelists write about 500 words a day. That's their sort of rule of thumb. So they don't write very much, and they probably get a lot more of it right on the first draft than I do. I write huge amounts, maybe sometimes 2,000 or 3,000 words a day. But I'm going to need to rewrite that. The novel that I've just finished, which is coming out next July, I can't tell you how many times I've been through it. Oh my God. And yet, you think you come to the end of writing a draft or tidying up a draft, and you think, I have absolutely tidied up all the repetitions. That's a real trick. Unfortunately, the way we write, we often repeat ourselves. The sentences that don't flow one from the other, the things that don't make sense, things that aren't, a bit boring, where you think, oh, okay, these pages are really dull. It's plodding. You've got to keep the pace up.
Dialogue. What would you say about dialogue? That's quite a skill, isn't it?
It's a real skill. And I know some of you are interested in script writing, and I mean, when I really didn't know how to do dialogue on the novel, I just had no idea at all. So when I had picked the novel up and I was redoing it in 2017, I thought, I've just no idea how to do dialogue. So I just kind of slapped it down, thinking, well, I don't think this novel's ever going to see the light of day. So what the hell? I was absolutely amazed when my publishers turned around and said, yeah, great, we love it. Yeah, we'll take it. And then I began a process of tidying it up. They said, there's a few things, you just need to change this, change that, not a lot. But actually I decided, it was almost as if I now had the confidence and the permission to go back to the novel and think, okay, I really want to get this as right as I possibly can. And dialogue was the thing that was really, really tricky. And in fact, I talked to a scriptwriter, film scriptwriter, and I said, how do I do dialogue? And he wasn't much help, actually. I think it's difficult for anyone. One of the things that's really always a good thing to do is to look at writers that you admire or respect, to look out for good dialogue. So I have just finished reading 2 books. One is Last Orders by Graham Swift, which is about 4 men, very working class men, who go to Margate to put the ashes of one of their friends into the sea. So it's kind of like, you know, saying goodbye. And that is almost all dialogue. And Graham Swift, I think, is one of the most amazingly skillful writers alive today, working in the UK, because every novel he writes is completely different from the one before. And in this Last Orders, he gets the sound and the intonation and the language of working class men in the 1980s who were themselves already in their 60s. So they'd fought in the Second World War. It's that sort of generation. He got the Booker Prize for it. I mean, it's a remarkable piece of fiction. And one of the things that the judges picked out, and the reviewers, was the language, that he had absolutely captured this sort of Bermondsey, Cockney, working class language. And it was sort of Shakespearean in its depth and its poignancy and its beauty. So he's brilliant. The other book that I read was Regeneration, which I know is some of you might be studying. Yes. For A-level English. And I read it years ago, and I was curious just to see what I thought of it now. But what was really interesting is how much of that is dialogue. Pat Barker is a very skillful writer. So the short answer, Margaret, is that, you know, there's no rules. There's no tips on dialogue other than listening. How good a listener are you? Do you sit on the bus and listen to other people's conversations, which is obviously very rude, but on the other hand, if you're listening to the turns of speech, that's a terrific thing to do. And maybe just very discreetly sort of jot it down on a notebook so you don't forget it, or jot it down in your phone, because I do think that in the end, it's the quality of your listening that comes through, because when you write dialogue, you are sort of listening. That's what you're doing. You're kind of thinking, okay, well, how would my character say this?
Yeah.
And that's how you do it.
Having a good ear, I think, is what it's known as. Something that might interest our history of art students about your novel is that you mention a painting by Lucas Cranach that has been stolen during the war and hidden for many years, and it's a real painting, isn't it? The Virgin and Child under an apple tree, and the story slightly revolves around, you know, the rediscovery of this painting. Was that story lost for me? Was that painting lost for many years, or did you invent that?
The whole sort of thread of the novel around the painting came out of the fact that when I was researching my book, my history, it was the beginning of the understanding that huge quantities of art had been stolen or sold or moved around Europe. So the film that many of you might have seen called Monument Men, which came out 4 or 5 years ago, was kind of capturing something of that. There've been a couple of other films, the Golden Woman or something, which is a much better film, which is about a Klimt that was stolen in Vienna, and a woman who went to LA, who was a refugee to LA from Vienna, who then managed to get the Klimt back. I can't try and remember the name of that film because that's a really good film. But the point was that somehow this bit of history had kind of got obscured, and there was a terrific non-fiction book that came out around the time I was researching, and so I got fascinated. Extraordinary stories of what people did to hide their art collections. Famously, one collector buried her entire collection in the dunes of North France and then couldn't remember where she'd buried them, and they've never been recovered. The other story that's fascinating is a couple in Jersey had fled from Paris from the Germans as refugees and had ended up in Jersey, and of course then got occupied. So they still had to deal with the Germans. But they were part of the avant-garde in Paris in the 1920s. So they had a very large modern collection of fascinating artists' work. And a lot of that went missing because the Germans seized it when they found it in their home in Jersey. So the Cranach well, that was my invention. It wasn't a crannock that meant, when, you know, there's no association between crannock. In the acknowledgements at the end of the novel, I say, don't worry, the crannock is in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. It was never stolen. It's entirely safe. But it's such an extraordinary painting, and Cranach is an extraordinary artist. And the Nazis had a particular fondness for Cranach, because, of course, he was a German artist, and so he would have, you know, there would have been a real premium on his paintings in those days. And I'm not going to give any more of the plot away in the novel, but you know, all these were kind of aspects about that enormous Second World War trade in stolen artworks, stolen out of museums, stolen from Jewish families and other collectors. So yeah, that's I wanted to weave that into the novel.
Interesting. So could we perhaps talk about your most recent book, which is very topical, and you probably didn't have any idea when you began writing and researching it, about the care system, about just how topical this would become because of the pandemic. But,
yeah.
your very recent book, I can show everybody here, is called Labours of Love, The Crisis of Care. And so it's a mixture, isn't it? It's about the care system in the sort of formal sense of care homes and the NHS, but it's also, rather interestingly, about all of us as carers and how we are all at various points in our lives carers for children or our parents, or we experience being cared for ourselves when we're children. So care is very much a part of our lives in different ways. What made you begin that project 5 years ago?
Well, I think I felt that you know, there was a lot of sort of, you know, people talked about your work and your work ethic, and you know, there was a lot of discussion about career and so forth. But actually, when I sort of looked at my life, I thought, well, actually, I've spent far more time offering and providing care for my family, my you know, my kids and relatives and so forth. And this is just as important as my work. It's just as absorbing and demanding and rewarding. And yet this is a form of work that just doesn't get acknowledged at all culturally. We live in a culture which has elevated the significance of paid work and career. And I think it's a deep sort of structural problem in the way our society is being constructed for centuries, that the care work that of kind of feeding and cleaning and cooking and the emotional labor, that's another really key phrase. I don't know if any of you are studying sociology, but there's a terrific sociologist who talks about emotional labor, you know, listening to people, cheering them up, supporting them, whatever they're going through in their lives. You know, this has always been regarded as women's work. And that means that the economists and the philosophers, Adam Smith, you know, the great sort of intellectual traditions of the West have never really given any time to it. They don't consider it. There's a wonderful book written by a Swedish journalist called Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner? Because there was the great economist and philosopher writing these great books that have been hugely influential. So any of you who are studying politics or philosophy or economics, you will have heard of Adam Smith, I'm sure. And yet somebody was making sure that he had supper every evening. And it was his mother. He famously never married, and his mother looked after him all his life. But the point is that he never put into his books this huge part of the economy, which is this unpaid labor, which is largely within the family and friendship. And so it was kind of wanting to ask, why is this so invisible? This great sort of activity, which actually loads of people spend a large part of their lives completely dominated by care. And one of the things I was very, very keen to do in my book was to interview men who've suddenly, for whatever reason, their partner suddenly falls sick, or their parent falls sick, or in some way or another, they find themselves as carers. So I was very, very keen to question this gendering, that care is something that women do. And to really kind of interrogate, what is it? What is care? And why is it that it has such little cultural value? So since the book came out in October, I've been doing loads and loads of talks and all sorts of interesting responses. But one of them is, you know, well, shouldn't we have an education system which helps kids growing up to understand that yes, they need a work ethic, and I'm sure all of you have had various occasions when teachers have talked about your work ethic, but what about a care ethic? Because actually in the course of your lives, you're going to need a care ethic, whether that's having kids, and that may seem very, very far off right now, but it's amazing how it arrives. But also in your friendships, there's all sorts of care going on, and I'm sure at some level you're aware of that, and you'll also be aware of the fact that you really rely on and need the care of other people. You might look out for your mate or your friend, or indeed you know that when you get back home there's going to be some food in the fridge. These are, you know, the basic sort of infrastructure of our lives. And the amazing thing is that I was writing a book which I felt was about a subject that is very invisible, and there I am finishing the book, the final finishing of the book in March, and I found myself on the doorstep along with everybody else clapping for our carers. I thought, this is astonishing. You know, the world's turned upside down, because actually what COVID has really demonstrated is the value of the work of people that we pay really badly for, but who in the end have been keeping us alive, literally alive. The care workers who continue to go into work, and the healthcare assistants who are going into the hospitals, the nurses, the doctors. And I think it's been an astonishing year for that, where I think we have been brought up really face to face with this kind of reality about how dependent we are on the care of others. So I would like to hope that this has really lasting effects, that that we'll begin to pay people properly for a work that's can be immensely demanding. You know, if you're a care worker going in to help elderly, frail, scared people who may even be facing the end of life, you know, that's hugely emotionally demanding work to do if you're doing it day in, day out. So we should be grateful to them for doing such a big task, and pay them decently so that they can look after their families. So, you know, it's a very political book, because I do think there's a real challenge here to the politics of our country, not just to the politicians, it's to ourselves as well, as an electorate. You know, what are we telling the politicians that we want in our government? What kind of policies? So yeah, it's been fascinating, and you know, I mean, it's been great to see the reception. The book has really touched a nerve, and that's, you know, as a writer, that's always a great feeling.
Did you form any particular views about the privatization of care that's gone on over, you know, recent decades, and whether care homes should be brought under the umbrella of the NHS? Would they be, you know, slightly more sort of controllable and understandable, and, you know, would they get more support in that way if they were? Did you?
So the book is not primarily a book about policy, because I think actually there've been some amazingly detailed, thorough reports, one after another, every 5 years or so. You know, a bunch of really clever experts come out with a brilliant report. So what I was trying to do was kind of write a challenge which anybody could pick up and read. You didn't need to be a policy expert, but the issue you raised, Margaret, is absolutely essential, and I did look at it a bit. I'm nervous about starting here, because this is the point where I go into a sort of rant, because the way, it's not just the privatization that's the problem, because care homes have been privatized. In the 1990s, the Tories, Conservative governments, couldn't privatize the NHS because it is held in such deep regard by the British public. But what they could do was privatize the care of the elderly. So homes for the elderly were privatized. The problem is not just privatization, it's something called financialization. And I don't know if any of you are studying economics, but this is a scandal. It is an utter scandal. What's happened is that there are several large chains of care homes for the elderly who have used the property of those care homes as a way of raising capital. So they basically build up huge amounts of debt. So say you've got a care home, say one of those lovely big houses in Belsize Park near the school, that's turned into a care home. Well, that building is worth millions and millions and millions. So they use the property to then borrow millions and millions and millions. So then the company is having to pay huge amounts of money in interest payments. So care homes are extremely expensive. If you have an elderly relative who needs to be in a care home, you will be paying thousands and thousands of pounds. And large chunk of that is going to pay the interest on these huge loans that the private equity companies have built up. So they've built this great sort of pyramid of debt. And what's happened is that several of these big companies then collapse because they've got such large debts that it comes a point where they can't pay the interest on the debts. And that's what happened with a large chain of homes. Twice it's happened now, which means then what happens to the care homes? What happens to the elderly people in those care homes who are, it's their home, and it's kind of hanging in the balance. I mean, the government has had to step in to prop these chains up. So you can see it's a shocking scandal. And just a year ago, funnily enough, recently I had to look up some material, and I found this report that a year ago they were saying our care system is so fragile and so under-resourced that it's just on the edge of a disaster. And that's what happened in April when the COVID death toll began to rise so steeply in care homes. So after this pandemic is over, which thank goodness we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, I think there will need to be some sort of reckoning with what's happened and how it happened. And, I hope some of you who may be going on to further education will be involved in making sure we understand the truth of what's happened. This pandemic has had the highest death toll in this country, in Europe, and we need to know why.
Absolutely. Yeah, many big issues have been thrown up by the pandemic, in many different ways. There are one or two questions coming through, Madeleine, aren't there? There was one earlier, Ruby, I don't know if you want to ask it in person and unmute yourself, or perhaps I have to unmute you, but you asked a moment ago about tabloid newspapers. I'm trying to unmute you, it doesn't seem to be working. About tabloid newspapers making people redundant and employing fewer staff. And I think you were asking, why is that happening? If you want to type up that question again really quickly, it would be good. But I think that was the gist of the question. I don't know if you saw it, Madeleine, a few minutes ago.
Yeah, Ruby, are you still interested in that one?
Yeah, I think
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just getting into my car.
That's okay, that's okay.
I'm listening though, sorry.
So Ruby,
all I was saying was...
it's a good question, yeah.
Yeah, no, it was back on your point before about starting up as a blog and then getting hired by papers. But I was just wondering how come all the tabloid papers are getting rid of so many of their staff then if they are looking for more?
Yeah. I think it's a good question, Ruby. Partly, I've answered part of it, which is that, just to agree with you that there are fewer jobs around, and it's not easy to get a job. I think there's another part though that I'd also want to add, which is that traditionally the way a newspaper has the kind of finances of a newspaper have worked is you had an advertising model. So, when you got a newspaper, there was great chunks of it that were advertising, and the advertising paid for the running costs of lots of it. I mean, basically, news is expensive. It's a really expensive thing. If you think of really well-qualified, serious people who are trying to find out information and put it together every day to produce hundreds of thousands of words and make it all lay out properly so you can read it easily, and it's got pictures and it's got graphics and it's got this and it's got that, that's a very complex operation, and you need dozens of people to do it. So seeing how that all works, hundreds of people literally all kind of working together to produce something every day. And what funded it all for most of my career was advertising. So the advertising department was extremely important, and the revenues that they were able to generate were absolutely vital to ensure that the Guardian could keep on paying the salaries and keep on paying the electricity bills. What's happened is advertising left print media and migrated onto the web, and because there's no limit on space in the web, it became possible, space became much, much cheaper. So the whole economic model which underpinned journalism has collapsed. And that's why my last job at The Guardian was on strategy. So I moved away from journalism and I looked at the strategy and the future of news organizations for the editor, Alan Rusbridger. And we were working on a project to find other ways of funding journalism, because the old model, which was advertisers primarily paid for the journalism, was no longer working. So when you buy a newspaper, if you think about it, I can't remember now how much The Guardian costs every day, but it's about the equivalent of a cup of coffee. Well, that doesn't go anywhere near the cost of running and producing a newspaper. Nowhere near. So the dilemma for all these news organizations faced with the collapse of their economic model was to think, okay, well, how are we going to deal with the web? And The Guardian did a very unusual thing, which I'm not sure many other news organizations, the Mail has done it as well, which is to put everything online and make it absolutely free and accessible. Now that means that The Guardian now has an audience of millions and millions all over the world, which is astonishing. It's absolutely incredible. You know, The Guardian's circulation when I first started was 500,000, and it's now dropped to about 100,000, I think. So far fewer people are buying the newspaper. But the last time I looked, The Guardian has a sort of 100 million visitors to its website every month. And that figure's probably out of date by now. So The Guardian has expanded into America, it's expanded to Australia, it's got these dedicated websites in both places. It's an enormous reach, but it's still got the challenge of how do we financially keep this whole thing afloat, because the advertising doesn't cover the costs. And the pandemic has made that a whole lot worse, because advertising has collapsed. Because, you know, if nobody can get into the shops, what's the point of advertising? So a lot of local newspapers are really struggling. The Guardian has adopted the approach that I was working on back in when I left The Guardian, which was to ask people for money, to basically turn The Guardian into a almost charitable enterprise, and to say, please give us money so that we can carry on producing independent, authoritative journalism. You know, we believe journalism is essential to democracy, quality information that you can trust. That was The Guardian's, has always been The Guardian's kind of ethos. And I don't know what you make of that, but the problem that your generation have got is, where do you get your information from? Because if you look at the net, there's just everything. And it comes from all sorts of weird nooks and crannies, and you can pick up conspiracy theories everywhere, and people can make up complete rubbish. So the question of what information do you trust has become a major question confronting your generation, and the implications of that in political terms, we can see it in America particularly, but also in the UK, is immense. And it's interesting that my former boss, you know, Alan Rusbridger, who's a terrific thinker and about the future of the media, has just resigned his post in Oxford to focus on precisely this issue. He's gone onto the board of Facebook, some sort of advisory board, which is around the ethics of Facebook. But he's hugely preoccupied with this question of how do we navigate this new terrain of information, because its political implications are so enormous and so serious to us about trust.
We've got a couple of other questions coming in. So Oscar is asking, do you think there is a problem with what news is getting coverage? So that's in the chat. And then Ruby's adding, has that not led to the quality of journalism being lower? So in the context of what you're saying, they're quite pertinent questions.
They are, absolutely.
So the sort of news that's getting coverage is not always real news, is one thing, isn't it? It can be fake.
And clickbait. You know, every time you go, if you go on the Daily Mail website sometime, Mail Online, I mean, just, you know, it's so crude, it's so simplistic. You know, almost invariably there will be a story about Harry and Meghan at loggerheads. And they know that, you know, the certain words in a headline will get the clicks, and the clicks is what gets the advertising revenue. It's a huge problem. So it's misinformation or rubbish information. Do we really need more gossip about Harry and Meghan's relationship? No, they're not even part of the royal family anymore. It's none of our business. So the impact of celebrity culture on journalism, the impact of kind of you know, I'm kind of a consumer culture, which is sort of, you know, I mean, one of the interesting debates in The Guardian is, should The Guardian be taking adverts for low-cost airlines? The Guardian has made this big pledge about the climate crisis, climate emergency. Should it take, I mean, what do you guys think? Should it be taking low-cost airline adverts? Should it be taking Land Rover adverts? You know, these kind of enormous cars that consume masses and masses of petrol. I mean, the one thing that was great at The Guardian is every morning at 10:30, 10 o'clock, we used to sit down in a big room, about 60 journalists, and discuss all the news that had happened the previous day, how we'd reported on it, and what was going to be the news for the day that day. And so we would have loads of arguments, loads of very passionate arguments with all sorts of views being expressed about the Iraq war, about Afghanistan, about climate emergency. Were we taking it seriously enough? I'm sure, you know, it's since I left, but Me Too will have really triggered lots of discussions. So there was the sense of a lot of people. The Guardian at that, when I was working there, employed about 1,000 people, maybe 600 in editorial. A lot of people really trying to engage seriously with the issues. And of course, we didn't always agree. Sometimes there were really, really sharp disagreements. So when you say, has it not led to the lowering of the quality of journalism? So there has always been this large underbelly, I would say, to journalism. You know, you only have to look at, you know, people in the 1920s and 1910s complaining about the fact that every crime was luridly covered. There's always been an aspect of the media which is kind of interested in sensationalism, which is interested in violence, scandal, etc. And I think it's essential that you have a free media, that the minute you start getting kind of legislation into place about, you know, what is, you know, how certain types of journalism are not appropriate, I think you run into problems. So there's a tension there, which, you know, all through my career at The Guardian, that tension of how you decide what journalism is useful and legitimate and what is not. You know, when is it right to go through someone's dustbins? You know, when is it right to hack a phone? The answer is no, it's not right to go into a dustbin, and it's not right to hack a phone. The Guardian was absolutely clear about those kinds of ethical principles in journalism, but many of its competitors weren't. And the phone hacking scandal, some of you probably won't remember this, but this was a big thing at The Guardian. It went on and on and on, where several tabloids had hacked personal mobile phones. And in the end, they were found guilty and they were sacked, and one newspaper closed, and then it led to a public inquiry as to how to raise standards in the media. And so there's this tension between the kinds of freedom that the media need, because people in power always want to stop the media asking too many questions about things that they don't want them to know about, and the privacy of people, and the respect for people. I mean, you know, libel, the idea you can say anything about someone, is not allowed in the UK. You can't do that. You run up against libel laws. In the US, I think it's much easier because you've got the First Amendment, free speech. So different countries strike the rules in different ways, but there's always an inherent tension there between certain principles around privacy, around decency, and the freedom of the press, and how you kind of manage that is, I think, tremendously difficult.
We've got another couple of questions here, but maybe we'll make these the last two questions because we're running out of time. Right, okay, so somebody in the media room, where there might be several people all watching together, how can we be sure that The Guardian isn't ideologically biased? It switched off comment is free when commentators wrote the wrong comments. That wasn't about filth, it was about content. So that's quite a big question. We haven't got very long, but I don't know if you've got anything you could say.
Well, you know, it's a great question. And, you know, when comment is free started, obviously getting all of those comments coming in, was a fascinating process to watch. Now, I don't have any inside track. You know, I haven't had a conversation with anybody at The Guardian about why they switched off the comments, but I have a very, very good hunch about why. So what happened was they thought, you know, you'd have a few rather sort of respectful Guardian readers who would make very interesting, thoughtful comments. What they got was hundreds of thousands of people, some of whom made really interesting comments, and some of whom were just trolls, kind of trying to trash the debate, rude, abusive, libelous, you name it. So then what happened is that the journalists were like, there's no way I can deal with these comments on my writing. So I would have hundreds of comments on my columns, and I was expected to go in and, you know, talk to these people. And sometimes they were just being really rude. I can't tell you the kind of abuse I got, particularly from American commentators when I disagreed with American foreign policy. So then there came this next stage, which is, okay, let's have some rules around the community guidelines, and we're going to have moderators. And the moderators they hired had to monitor all the comments and delete ones that didn't meet the rules of the community, which was, you know, a certain degree of respect, etc. Now that became expensive. Hiring moderators, that was creating new jobs. And then you had to hire more moderators because the number of comments kept on increasing. So the problem is, if you are a very financially strapped organization, which The Guardian is, it doesn't have a lot of money, you're cutting journalism jobs. I suspect you have to cut your moderators too, at which point you can't risk the kind of horrible stuff that gets posted as comments. So that's one possible answer. To go to the point about The Guardian's ideological bias, The Guardian is biased. Of course it is. Of course it is. Every single newspaper is. Now, the point about bias is every newspaper comes from a worldview. They have a certain understanding about how things should be. The New York Times is clearly a democratic newspaper. It profoundly disagrees with Trump and all his politics. I think what's really important is to find a newspaper that you think does its best to keep its bias in check. And you probably won't get further than that. So take The Economist, which is biased to the right. The Economist is a very, very good magazine, fabulous journalism. I don't agree with a lot of its economic positions or its policies, but I, you know, hands up, first to say it's brilliant journalism. And I would read it for some things that I was interested in. I would read it, knowing that where their bias is and what their bias is about. So this is about being a sophisticated reader. And I think it's really, really important to learn as you are, 17, 18, coming up to that age, to start thinking about how you read information. Who's producing this information, and, you know, what kind of worldview lies behind it. And that is a kind of necessary part, I think, of knowing how to deal with information as an adult.
Right. Okay, that's really interesting. There's a question here from Oscar. Do the public have a duty to take action on things that they hear in the news? People say that they care, but nothing is done.
So I'm just looking at the time. Shall I take Ruby's last question as well at the same time, Margaret?
Okay. So Ruby's last question is, what about the criticism that The Guardian only preaches to a very select audience, but then can't you argue that's not benefiting democracy?
So these are really great questions. Thanks very much, Oscar.
Yeah. Well
You're
done.
You're really taking a good interest in this, and that's great to see. Well done. You know, and kind of keep going, because it's important stuff. So, do the public have a duty to take action? Well, Oscar, I couldn't agree with you more. This is a key question. And as a journalist, I can't tell you the number of times that I would report on something and think, I haven't done enough. I need to do more. Something about the story made me feel I need to keep doing more. I mean, some of my journalism I definitely saw as a kind of campaigning, particularly around issues of global inequality. I did a lot about Africa and environmental issues in Africa. Do they have a duty? Yes, I think it's part of political engagement. But I also would say, you know, I'm well aware that everybody has lots of calls on their time and lots of things they should be doing. And you know, that's where you have your moral choices. That's where you make the decisions as an adult. You know, I was saying to a friend this afternoon, it's going to be great when lockdown's all over and we've got the vaccines, because we'll be able to go back to protesting. Because there was a point last year, I don't know if any of you went on the environmental march with the school kids, but you know, I did, and then there was the Brexit march and I was there, and you know, then there was the Trump march and I was there. So I believe that there are things you need to do as a citizen. You know, that's my belief, is that you do need to get engaged. That unfortunately democracy only lasts from one generation to the next, because each generation steps in and sort of provides the lifeblood of it, which is about argument and debate and protest and making your case. And that really in a way goes to Ruby's point as well, which is, yes, the Guardian does preach to an audience. I don't know about how select, but you know, I've got your point. You do have a point, but when it's hundreds of millions across the globe, I'm not sure how select it is, but it is a particular audience. And I still think that that's fine. I mean, the Times speaks to its audience, the Economist speaks to its audience, the Financial Times, you know, speaks to its audience of bankers and you know, financiers. I think you're right that there's an issue whereby more and more kind of gaps have appeared between these different audiences, that the way in which we learn about each other's arguments is important. And I think the BBC has played a hugely important role as a national broadcaster in kind of providing a sort of place and a forum and programs where all these different points of view can be aired. And you know, inevitably, there's arguments about, well, the BBC only broadcasts to a select audience and it doesn't reach everybody. And I think that the problem about social media is that we all end up in these echo chambers. And that is a really, really big worry. So I must say there was a point in a way which goes to both Oscar and Ruby at the same time. After 2016, the Brexit vote, which I thought was just disastrous, I was in Romania and we got talking to two German students, and they said one of the German newspapers had done a really, really interesting project. When there was a massive influx of Syrian refugees into Germany, it was deeply divisive. I think it was about 2015, they took 1 million refugees. And they did it for very, very good intentions. They wanted to sort of clear their historical record, do something to help a desperate country. But it divided Germany right down the middle. And what the German newspaper decided to do, was to match people from different sides of this divide. People who thought that you should take the refugees and people who thought you shouldn't take the refugees. And to link them up so that they could have conversations with each other. And then the newspaper reported on these conversations, whether people felt a bit more, they understood the other's point of view. Anyway, I got really keen that the Guardian should do something like that about Brexit, because I think there's a danger that the Guardian does end up sort of, you know, being in a bit of a holy huddle, you know, rather self-righteous and so forth. And I thought it would be good if the Guardian tried to reach out beyond that audience and find people who wouldn't normally read the Guardian to really hear their points of view. But you know, I wasn't any longer at the paper, and I tried a few friends who are still at the paper. You know, I still call it the paper. I'm still at the Guardian, but it didn't go anywhere. There is one journalist, John Harris, who produces fantastic videos, and I would really recommend, I'll just type his name, I recommend you looking at them, because I think John really tries to get out into those communities which are not Guardian reading, no interest in the Guardian worldview, and he really tries to understand what's making this community tick and what's going on here. So, you know, Guardian journalists still have that passion to understand, you know, points of view that are not their own. And I think that's has huge democratic value.
Right, that is fantastic, Madeleine. Thank you so much for giving us your time today. I think, you know, the students obviously really engaged with some of those issues. That's so many interesting things were covered there. So thank you very much indeed for sparing the time. And
Pleasure.
You've given us lots to talk about in tutorials and around the college. So
great.
Many thanks indeed.